Thank you, Captain Azar, for helping out with the tech side. I appreciate it very much. Good morning, everybody. Good afternoon. Hello, welcome to our very first fan lacing workshop. I'm so excited, as I have been extolling for the last 30 minutes. I'm so excited to be here with all of you in the class, and I'm really excited to share these techniques with you. Now, there are lots and lots of ways to approach fan lacing. This is an introductory class, so we are going to do the simplest method possible. There are more complicated methods, there's more complicated hardware you can use. I will be honest, I love the way the hardware looks, but you have to order it from Europe. So I decided I did not want to order hardware from Europe every time I want to do fan lacing. So, and that's because it's not something that everybody does. So, not that much of this hardware gets produced. It's very specialized. And a lot of that kind of corsetry tradition is practiced in Europe. So it makes sense why it's available there, but we are at a disadvantage in North America. So that said, I create a fabric belt rather than using hardware for my fan lacing, and it makes it a little bit more accessible as a starting point, and the style of lacing is a little bit less complicated. It's roughly the same, except if you use a continuous lace with the hardware and do all of that stuff, you have to do more math in your head. So this version requires less math in advance and is more forgiving and a little bit faster to set up. I love that as a starting point. So if you've seen pictures, one of these is pictured on all of the little promos and advertisements for the class. My rainbow corset that has fan lacing in the back of it. It is cattywampus right now, but you can see I have these fabric belts that are attached to my laces, and that does the job of the hardware. The laces are just sewn in to those belts, which is very handy. The other cool thing is you can make your belt look like anything you want. So when you get comfortable with the fan lacing, if you're like, I want to really like theme my belt to fit the corset, and I did like a forest dryad corset. So I'm going to make my belt look like a leaf that comes off the back of my corset. If you're up for that level of sewing skill, if you do feel comfortable sewing around the shape of a leaf, you can do that for your fan lacing. Like there are no rules at this point for what your belt can look like. Typically, rather than shaping the belts, so I did like a little triangle here or sort of a diamond to kind of pick up on the pride um, flag, because that is my pride corset. It is essentially like I dressed myself as a pride flag. Um, for my first fan lacing project, I did a much more traditional style of belt. And that is just this kind of little wedge shape. And it's very straightforward. It's very bare bones. It looks elegant. It worked out beautifully, but it's certainly not a fancy shape. This was a very comfortable shape to start with on fan lacing. And so if you're like, oh, I don't know that I want to design some really complicated shape for my first time, I don't really recommend starting with a complicated shape. I do recommend starting with something roughly like this. This is what I'm going to be drafting with you all today for the course that I'm converting to show you how to make something kind of like this. Hello, Jake. Hello, Kitty. Oh my goodness. So I'm going to be converting a corset I made at the beginning, well, sort of in 2021, I think. So this corset, there's a lot going on with it. I really love it. I don't wear it as much anymore. I would do some things differently with it. It was a big experiment, but I love it. And so I'm excited to convert it to fan lacing because I will wear it more often. Now that I've gotten into fan lacing, I actually don't want to go back. I will warn you about that. Once you embrace the fan lacing, all other lacing may be dissatisfying. So the one challenge I will warn you about with fan lacing is it can add a little bit extra bulk around your waist in the front. So you want to think about that a bit if you're like a tight lacer who makes really vain costumes with no ease. You might have to like make some adjustments or put a hook in to hold your laces under your waist, which is a very traditional solution. And I'll show you where you could put that hook. But this is my cotton bobinette corset that I did, and is very lightweight. So as an aside, I think I have decided that in the fall, I'm going to be teaching a single layer corset class, which is what you need to create something like this. So if you are like, ooh, I want a mesh corset, come take a class with me this fall. They're very lightweight. As you can see, it's sheer and it's super comfortable. It feels like I'm not wearing a corset like at all. It super feels like cheating at corsetry because it's so lightweight. So I do love this. And I want to be able to wear it again in the hot summer months. So creating a fan lacing for it will be really nice. It's also my opportunity to be like, hey, if you've got corsets you love, that you want to switch over to fan lacing, you don't need to make a new corset. It is just upgrading the corset you have. So we're going to take out these laces and we're going to put in the fan lacing. And oh my gosh, I see where my cat has taken some bites into my mesh corset. Nothing's ruined. There are just some bite marks. Thank you, Cake. We have a lot of cat owners here, so I know you know. Um, at this point, as we're getting started, the big thing you're going to need painter's tape. You don't have to have it, but I recommend it. I'll show you why. I find it very helpful. You're also going to need a lot of pins, and you're going to want to have lacing. I'm going to use as much of the original laces as I can, because they're still in good shape. They're not worn out. This corset hasn't been worn that much. And I know that I use like 12 plus yards of lace in this guy. I do also have a lot of lacing because I make corsets. So I usually just have lacing in the house. I use a cotton woven lace that I get from Richard the Thread. I love Lois. We have a great relationship. I'm a very stalwart customer of Richard the Thread, but there are other corsetry supply stores in the United States that may work better for you. If you're east of the Mississippi, I recommend using corsetsupplies.com because they are closer to you and the shipping is faster. The prices work out to be very similar to Richard the Thread. They're both like roughly in parity. Some things will be slightly more expensive at one, slightly cheaper at the other, but it kind of works out. So, there's also farthingales in Canada. Those are like the big three corset supply companies. You can get some corset supplies through places like Mood, and through Etsy. If you have questions about corset resources, once this class is done, if you're not already part of the corset making group, you will be added to the corset making group and you can ask questions there about supplies and other resources. A lot of wonderful corset makers are now in that class, and I'm so delighted by our community. So that is my plug on where I like to buy things. If you are using a double-sided satin lace meant for corset lacing, that is totally fine. it may be an advantage because the satin will be a little slick and it will pull through your grommets with a little bit more motion. But all of mine are done with cotton laces, and once they're broken in, they move fine. So it will work out with cotton laces. Of course, you could also use like round woven cotton lacing that is like what you use in boots and things. It's a little harder to sew through because it's thicker. So that is the one thing that would give me pause, but there's no reason not to use that if that's what you want. People who are doing the hardware version of this will often use round lacing rather than the flat lacing because the holes on the hardware are round and it's a little easier to get the round lace through that. There's some beautiful round satin covered corsetry lace that you can get from like Orchard Corsets and places like that. I don't know where they're sourcing it, so I can't recommend a shop. I'm not like friends with them. I just admire their work. But this is what I use. I use the flat cotton lace. I like it for lots of reasons. It's very strong. Also, it's dyeable. And I love to dye my laces to match my corsets when I have time. So anyway, that said, this is a white and purple corset, so I can just use my white lacing. And what I'm doing right now, as we are chatting, is I'm just getting my corset laid out on the table, and I am going to make sure to mark where my waist is. So you don't have to do it with your belt lined up with your lace, your waist. On the rainbow corset, I just lined my belting up with the middle part of the corset bag. It works beautifully. It looks nice. It's very symmetrical. That's what I wanted. With the red and black corset, I lined it up with my waist because I wanted the belting to contour and go over the belt that I made with the waist tape in my corset so they would lie over each other. And so that is why I positioned it that way. With this purple corset, I also want it to line up with the belt that I made that is internal to the corset. There are, of course, pros and cons for any approach. Um, I'd say that with this, aesthetics is king. What feels comfortable is always the most important thing you can do. But like the belt should also look pretty, right? It's going to be visible on the outside of your corset whenever your corset is visible. And it's always going to be visible to you when you're getting dressed. So it should look nice. It should please you. Um, Not at the expense of comfort, in my opinion, but that's a personal choice. So I'm just going to show you how I find the waist. It's very easy. And then I'm going to mark it, and then we're going to unlace the old corset. Okay, so here is my corset with the laces undone. And it's typically very easy to find your waist on a ready-made corset because your little rabbit ears should be at the waist. However, if you've been wearing a corset that you got ready-made that you did not make yourself, and you've felt like it shifts up or down on your body and the waist doesn't seem to be quite where it needs to be, this is a great opportunity to look at the wrinkles on your corset because they will tell you a story about where that waist is. And you can see at my waist, there is this little telltale wrinkle that says this has done a little bit of breaking in, wearing in, so it started to settle at my waist. I'd say you want to make sure that you have this feeling of where your waist is before you put the entire thing together with the fan lacing. Fan lacing is not impossible to undo, but it's an awful lot of work to like create the whole thing and be dissatisfied with it. We've got a couple of turn back points if you're like, ooh, that's not working, before you're like, oh my gosh, I just have to cut this whole thing apart. Right. So find your waist. Once you're satisfied with where the waist is, or you feel comfortable with moving your waist to where you need it to be, I like to pin mark things. And I'm just going to put a little pin in the middle of where my waist should be on both sides. These are silk pins because this purple portion is silk, and they're very sharp. But the best part of them are these little heads on the pins. They're called comfort grip pins. And I mention this every time. I love them. They're so comfortable. They really are. They make my life a lot easier, especially when my hands are tired. So now that I have these marked, it's time to take my corset lacing out. If you've had your corset for a long time, or you bought it um, ready-made, it may not come undone at the knot. So if that's the case, scissors are your friend. I mean, I'm going to be cutting this lace up anyway, so I don't technically need to struggle with untying it, but sometimes I have just a little bit of tenacity and I decide I'm going to do it the hard way. The funny thing for me, unlacing the corset, it takes so much less time than lacing it did. It's always very dissatisfying. Because the lacing, man, that even doing regular lacing, you're looking at 20, 30 minutes. But unlacing it, you're looking at 2 minutes.
Just like when you're putting it on and off.
Yes, absolutely the case. Man, it's like takes forever to put the thing on, except not once you have the fan lacing in place. Um, Honestly, once my corsets are broken in and they have the fan lacing, I can get into a corset in like 10 minutes, which is crazy. It used to be the case if I was lacing myself into a corset on my own with no help, I was looking at 45 minutes to an hour to get into that corset. Partly because I'd run out of steam halfway through and I'd need a break, and then I'd need a cup of tea, and then I'd need a pep talk to keep going.
Yeah, ladies' maids are far harder to find nowadays.
They really are. I would love it if we could just to have a squadron of ladies' maids available at costuming conventions, so we could like all sign up for like our hour to get dressed with an assistant. Um, Now, there are lots of reasons I wanted to do fan lacing. I've been interested in it since the first time I saw it. I just think it looks cool. But the real advantage to me is like the ease of getting dressed. I normally travel with the Grand Arbiter, and he is an absolute delight. He's perfect in every way, of course, but he's not good at lacing or unlacing corsets, and it really stresses him out. A few years ago, I fell and I dislocated my right shoulder, which was very painful, you all. It didn't heal right. So I have a lot less mobility in my right shoulder than I did before that. And I just can't lace my own corsets anymore. I can kind of do it left-handed, but I'm not left-handed, and I'm not Inigo Montoya, so it's a real challenge. If you are dealing with cheap lacing that you don't care about, you don't have to take the time to unlace. You can literally just cut it off. But this is nice lacing. I'm going to repurpose it. I want to keep it around. This is my forearm workout for the day. So now that we are unlaced, there are many approaches. There are always many approaches to just about every sewing project. But I like to get my corset lined up on my work table at this juncture. And because I've worn the corset before, because I'm comfortable with it, because I know what my size is, I'm aware of how much room I needed back to get this corset on. So I'm going to open my corset up on my work table. So I've got this 1, 2, 3, 4, 5-inch gap in the back. That's all I really need to get this corset on. So when I'm setting up the fan lacing, I want to make sure that I have at least that amount of room that I need in my corset opening and back so that I can get it on if the fan lacing is at exactly this position. You have some flexibility once the fan lacing is in to make it wider, and it will close all the way if you need it to. So that said, though, I want to at least have it so I know I've got this space as a minimum. We all bloat, we all have fluctuations in our bodies. And so I think it's important to remember that corsets should be flexible. They are meant to flex in and out with your body's adjustments, but you want a minimum. So that is something that's very personal. Hopefully you are using a corset you've worn before, or at least in a size you are comfortable with and you are familiar with how it fits you. I do recommend putting on any corset that you are converting at least once before you do the conversion, so you can make sure the corset is comfortable, that you understand where your waist should go, and that you have a sense of how much of a spring you need in the back to get your corset in position. You can see where Cake chewed on my corset. So helpful, Cake. Now I'm going to take my wonderful painter's tape. I'm actually going to shift myself over here a little bit. Can you guys see this pretty well on the camera?
Yes.
Okay, good.
Yes, just fine.
Great. Good. The other thing I do, and this is very helpful to have a grid on my table. If you don't have a grid, I recommend using a ruler to measure and make sure everything's lined up. But I'm also making sure the top and the bottom edges are pretty even with each other before I tape it down. I'm going to tape my corset into position. Hold on. Get a nice fresh edge here. This is painter's tape. It's very important that you use painter's tape because it will not leave a weird adhesive residue on your corset. I am taping this back away like a few inches from my corset edge. I do want some ability to pick this edge up. So I don't want it taped right here because then it's hard to pick this up. I'm going to be lacing in and out of these holes, my grommets. So I want enough motion that I can get into them. But I want my corset to be kind of stable so it's not moving around on me. And this space isn't shifting too much while I'm working so I can keep it even the whole time. And, I go in, I'm like really part of that school of measure 3 million times, cut once. I love painter's tape. I use it a lot actually in the workshop. It's great for lots of sewing things, but it's also really good for holding your pleats in place when you're traveling. Okay, so now that I have this lined up, I'm going to grab some scraps of coutil. I always have coutil around in my house, but honestly, canvas will work, denim will work. You just want something that's fairly stable and that's pretty strong, because this is going to be like your little base anchor for your laces. It doesn't have to be pretty. It doesn't have to be exactly even on either side. It doesn't have to look like anything. This is going to be hidden inside your belting. No one will ever see this anchor except for you. I recommend making your anchor a couple of inches deep. And like, I know that I want my belt to line up with the belt that I made for this corset. So I want my anchor to be just a little narrower than my belt. If you're like, ooh, that is too narrow, madam, you can certainly go bigger. You can do what works for you on this portion, but you want to remember that whatever you do for your anchor needs to fit inside what you have planned for your belt. So I've cut like a nice little 2-inch block for myself. I'm just going to come over here and get a sense of what I need that to be size-wise. See how I'm just like basically eyeballing it. There will be an opportunity to trim like little corners away to get it shaped to fit in your belt, but you want the rough starting point to be just within the margins of the belting you're going to use. These are offcuts from all kinds of projects I've done over the years. I use coutil, of course, to make corsets, but I also use it for making the grand arbiters, corseted waistcoats, and I sometimes use little scraps for cuffs and collars that need to be stiffer or to stand up, because the coutil is just very stable. It's also super lightweight, very thin fabric, so it doesn't create a lot of bulk. These are all things I love about it, but it's like too expensive to use as an interfacing for like a whole garment that's not a corset. So I usually rely on scraps I have left over. Anyway, so now that I have got this in place, I am going to kind of line these guys up right here in the center, lined up with my center marks. And I want to just keep coming back and make sure I'm not like being pulled up or drifting down. I want to just continue to make sure I'm lined up. I'm also lining it up so that they're at roughly the same position on the corset. It's a lot about making sure that you have symmetry. Hey, can you see that okay? All right. It's very important that your lace actually crosses and makes a little cross. It shouldn't just go from side to side, because then it won't close your corsets. It'll just move through these holes and be pretty. You want it to actually come through this hole and cross over to your anchor. and then get pinned in place. Oh my gosh, so chagrined. It happens.
Just want to confirm though, that middle one though is still straight across.
No, I'm gonna fix it.
Oh.
It is wrong. The middle one is absolutely wrong. But I'm just fixing the one that I had the length to fix without cutting a new lace and starting all the way over. So cross, cross, pin. So let's redo this middle lace since I did it wrong. This is the first lace we started from. I'm gonna pull that guy out. Move these guys over here. And we want to do the same thing, come through the hole, one side to the other, straight across. That part is right. Okay, so we're gonna I'm coming from right, because I'm right-handed, honestly. To left with my lace. Okay. At this juncture, your lace is going straight across, okay? Your corset grommets should be even. Your lace should go straight across. But now, this is the part I missed, and I apologize. You want to take the end that went through the left side of your corset and you want to cross it over to be pinned on the anchor fabric. Okay. I'm pinning my laces pretty close together. The larger your anchor, the more room you have to play with. Okay, so side A comes across, side B from the right side crosses over to the left side. And then it'll line up next to its little friends there. Like so. So now we've got this kind of overlap of laces. And when I pull on them, you can see they want to pull together. And very important. If the tape wasn't there, they would pull together. I'm going to move my laces down just a little bit on my anchor. I really want this middle lace to be kind of in the middle of the anchor. I'm also trying to keep my laces from getting overlapped with each other or like crossing over the wrong way. Part of the reasons I do the anchor and the pins is to keep things from getting tangled as I'm working. The other thing you want to make sure is that you keep a certain amount of tension in your laces. You don't want them to be like super loose because then you'll have an unknown amount of play in your laces. And when you go to pull, they won't pull with the same amount of force evenly across your laces. So you want it to be kind of even. I also generally like to make sure, because I have OCD, I kind of make sure my laces are crossing in the same direction. So for me, my left lace is crossing over the right lace. And I will try and do that every time. If you do not, it will not affect the integrity of your lacing. It may be a little weird looking in the back. If they're doing different things, it'll look a little bit tangled. And if something gets twisted, you may have a harder time untangling them. I find it's easier if everything is going the same direction and it looks more visually satisfying for me. So, all right, we've got our two laces going. Any questions? Since I made a grave error, I hope that I haven't confused you entirely. I'm hoping the silence means no questions and everything makes total sense. And you're all enjoying a nice cup of tea.
Yes, everything makes total sense.
Thank you, Martha. If you don't have a bodkin and you don't have a ready, um, safety pin, just cut a little angle in your lace. So you have a bit of a point to go through your hole. If your holes are like really small, like these guys, your bodkin may not travel with as much ease as you like. Mine is not actually. It's being a little sticky. So then I go again from right to left because I'm right-handed. You can go either direction, but just I try and do it consistently the same direction every time. I go from side A to side B. This is the end of the B side. This is the end of the A side. And I'm going to cross side A over to my anchor. I'm going to pin it and trim. And now I'm going to take my side B. I'm going to cross it over so it's the left is going over the right. And I'm going to pin it in position. Make sure that everything is still where I want it to be. If you're like, boy, I don't want to trim away, you can always get things adjusted and then trim the lace. A lot of pins. I do sometimes stab myself and end up with a little sacrifice for the sewing gods. Again, I'm going from side A to side B. And this is why we want to have that play, because sometimes you need to lift up the corset to get your little lace through the grommet. Now, I'm going to take side A and move it over to side B. And then I'm going to take side B and move it over to side A. It's super too long, so I'm going to adjust it. And check again. Still very long, so I'm going to adjust it. Make sure. Yep, that's more the size I want it to be. So now I'm going to take side A. I'm going to move it over to side B. Pin it in position. going to take side B and move it over to side A and pin it into position. Let's see how that fan lacing is starting to come together and have that signature look. Rinse and repeat. Starting on side A, moving to side B. I come from the top, through the grommet, underneath, and I'm going to come from the underneath side of side B, pull my corset lace up, make sure everything's nice and smooth, check my length, make sure I'm not getting too much excess in my corset lace, and keeping it lined up with the other laces. So now I'm going to take side A. I'm going to pull it over to side B. And I'll line it up, pin it. And then I'm going to take side B and move it over to side A and pin it. Give myself a good stab as I go. We've just got 2 more holes up here. You can see it's going to be pretty tight on my little anchor. If you're like, oh my gosh, I miscalculated the width of my anchor, it's not going to be roomy enough for my corset laces, I'm concerned. You can overlap your laces if you need to. You can always put another little length of coutil sort of tacked in place underneath to make a extend your anchor. This anchor portion can look super ugly. It's never going to be visible. It's absolutely just a functional piece of the corset rather than a visible piece. And before we finish, we'll go in, we'll make sure everything's the right length and we don't have any things like this where the tension is off in the lace. So again, I'm going to come from side A to side B, from the top to the bottom, from the bottom through to the top. I'm going to pull my little anchors out of the way because they're stabbing me. I'm going to check my length. Okay. That's where I want it to be, roughly. And I just adjust the whole time I'm going, right? To make sure that everything's smooth, everything's symmetrical, and that I'm not accidentally adding in some ease that I don't want. But we haven't sewn anything, so there's still time to fix anything where your laces have gotten cattywampus as you're working, where you've started to have a little bit of ease you didn't intend. Okay, last lace for the top. Gonna come from the top on side A, through my grommet to the underside, go across to side B, come from the underside through to the top. Make sure nothing's twisted. Pull it through, check. That's the length I want. I'm going to pin side A to side B on that anchor. It's okay if your laces go all the way up to the edge of your anchor because it doesn't need a seam allowance. It's going inside the belt. The belt will need the seam allowance. We're going to do this final lace from the top. Looks so nice. All right, so now we've got our top done. It's time to come in and do the bottom half of the corset. I'm gonna take a moment to look. There's like a couple of laces here that I need to tighten up. I just unpin them and I pull them a little tauter and I pin them back in place.
I have what will hopefully be a quick question.
Yes,
So my waist isn't in the middle of the corset.
that's okay.
Okay, so does it matter that my waist lace is at the middle of my little anchor? Does that make a difference?
It does not.
Okay.
So what matters really, it's aesthetics. Um, so the most important thing is that your laces are not tangled, that they're smooth, and that the tension is even going across. Or roughly even. We're not automatons. We're not going in here with a pressure gauge and like levers and pulleys and engineering equipment to make sure that the tension is exactly, down to the atom the same. But the most important thing is that the tension is the same. So I did two different styles, or I showed two different styles. One where I made my belt center on my corset, regardless of where my waist was, just because that's what I liked. And on the other one, I put my belting so that it lined up with my waist instead of with the center of my corset. And so that was just an aesthetic choice, really. So the functionality remains the same. And if you're like, oh, things have gotten cattywampus, this is your opportunity to pull everything into position where you want it to be and to confirm you're happy with things. So, because we haven't sewn anything, you can always like backtrack, fix. You can also like pin your little anchor in position for a moment as you're like checking your tension and making sure that you have things like lined up. So I can see where I have like a couple of places I just need to adjust my tension. And all I do is I unpin the end and I pull the lace more into the kind of even tension. And immediately it starts to look a little nicer. You can see more of that fan lacing pattern coming into visual play. This is also why you want to have a little bit extra lace because it's imprecise. There's a lot of estimation as you're working. Estimate, adjust, fix, shift. I like to get this tension straight as sort of even as I'm going because I've had situations where I did not do that, and then I was able to get my fan lacing on, no problem, but it was just a little less smooth, and it would have a tendency to get a little tangled. So now the top half is done. Again, Shannon asked a great question. Your belt, your anchor can be in sort of a zone of position on your corset. I wouldn't put it all the way at the top or all the way at the bottom because that's gonna like maybe pull a little weird. You want it to pull kind of evenly. But to be honest, you could actually do two anchors. You can get really creative. This is like the master sourdough starter recipe for breads. Once you've mastered the recipe and you feel comfortable with it, you can be more creative in how you set up your anchor and how you divide and conquer your laces. The big thing is you want it to always be sort of even distribution of your tension and to keep your laces very symmetrical because that improves your experience with pulling these. It's a pulley system. So you want the leverage of the tension to be pretty even as you're pulling on your belts. Okay, so we're going to do the bottom half, but this is a great opportunity to take a moment, have a sip of tea. If you have any questions at this juncture, it's a good time to ask some questions. You can see things do shift around a bit as you're working, but having this tape in place really helps it shift less. So you're not constantly fighting the motion of your corset as well as getting all of these laces kind of jiggered into position. Okay, so
I have some questions.
yes, Martha.
What is the typical blood sacrifice for a corset?
Oh, that's great. I'd say at least an ounce.
Okay. So my next question is, because I've been taking notes.
Oh, good.
When you originally started with those little anchors, they looked
Yes.
like they were near the seam, like near the tape, like 2 or 3 inches from the edge. And
Yeah.
now they look like they're an inch from the edge. Where should
That's
they, like, how far out should they be?
Yeah. So when I started, Martha, I was making a mistake and I was like, oh, I know that lace needs to be longer. So I just moved my anchors back, but I'd forgotten to cross them in the center. So you want it to be at least an inch back from the edge.
Okay.
If you're like, man, I know my body. I bloat a lot at the middle of the month, or, when I'm tired, I want my corset to be tighter to like give my back more support. So I need more range in how much I can pull my corset together. You can always give yourself more maneuvering room with your laces by moving your anchor a little bit further back and giving more lacing here in the back. So that's a great question, and it's something I had not articulated. So thank you for asking me. And when I shifted it forward, I wasn't clear why I was doing that. It was sort of like internally, I realized I'd made a mistake and I was just adjusting. But great question. Any other questions? Is the notation of side A to side B working for you, or is that a little bit confusing? Because I can change up the way I'm talking about it. Okay.
No, that's
I
working.
think, oh. Go ahead, Michelle.
Yes,
I was just gonna say the side A, side B notation is working for me, but
great.
I'm just
Excellent.
hoping. So.
Thank you, Michelle, though. I really appreciate the feedback. Martha?
Oh, I was gonna say the same thing because I think that your monitor is also, or your picture might be reversed. So if you say right and left, it might not be your right and left and our right and left.
Exactly. It varies. It should be like mirrored appropriately for you all, but you know what? Sometimes technology makes my brain hurt. And so the way in which I can manipulate 3D objects in my head for sewing is not what I can do for technology. Um,
Yeah,
right. So we are,
it's mirrored
yes.
appropriately. Your right hand is on our right side. So
Okay, great. Awesome. Thank you. Okay, so now we're moving down to the bottom edge of our corset. You can decide, do you want to switch the direction that your laces go because visually you want it to look different, or do you want everything to continue to be lined up with this side B lace over the top of your side A lace? And so I'm probably going to keep it the same. Again, it's like the OCD thing is sometimes a bit of a bear, but symmetry can be super important to my itchy brain. So I'm coming from side A, my lace is going from the top to the bottom through that grommet hole, and I'm going to go to side B, and I'm going to come from the bottom to the top through the grommet hole. And again, I'm just going to make sure that I have roughly the tension I want going across and going across. So let me show you what I mean. I've been having you guys cross your laces so that side B is, or rather the lace from side A goes to side B, and then the lace from side B crosses over and goes to side A. So the cross is on top with that lace. But if you're like, ooh, I want to mirror from top to bottom, you can always put your side B to side A on the bottom. And then you can put side A to side B on the top. So your crosses start reversing as they go down to the bottom edge of the corset. That would be sort of more similar to the way corsets are laced when you just have the continuous cross lace. I tend to like things to be symmetrical all the way down, though. So when I'm doing it for myself, I go and I put side A to side B, and then I cross side B over the top of side A, like so. I guess my point is that no matter what you do, just be consistent in your choice and realize that you do get to make choices that work for you aesthetically. And as always, as I'm going across, I'm making sure that things are not twisted because honestly, of all the challenges you can have, the twisting is the one that's the biggest problem because it's impossible to fix once you've got everything sewn together. It will be uncomfortable long term, and it will make pulling on the belting a little bit trickier in terms of like getting a nice smooth pull. So you want to keep things untwisted. Sometimes laces are going to twist on you as you are wearing a corset normally. With the fan lacing, you should have a little bit less of that twisting. It's not going to be totally gone, but you want to try and prevent it as much as you can for comfort. For comfort and smooth wearing. Okay. Here we go. We're going to come from side A to side B through the top of our side A grommet to the bottom side of the grommet. We're going to go over to side B, come from the bottom of side B up through the top. I am honestly just untwisting as I go. I think it's habit from years of doing corset making. And I am checking the length as I get things sorted to get it roughly where I want it to be before I trim. So side A goes to side B and gets pinned in place. Side B crosses over side A and pins in place. Okay. You see, we use a fair number of pins as we go. And I just check everything. I make sure I'm still happy with it, get everything sort of pulled in position. This thing I do, the checking, I do it throughout the process just to confirm so I can make any little adjustments before I get too far along. I'm coming from side A, going through the top of the grommet to the bottom, to side B, from the bottom through to the top. Check my length. Check my length. And I'm going to trim. Pin. So side A goes to side B, gets pinned in place. Side B goes to side A, pins in place. Okay. We've got 3 more little grommet holes for mine. Now, I will also say that everybody's corset is different. I have a long torso, so I probably have a few more grommet holes than a short torsoed person. I also like to do these small grommets, and I place them about an inch, inch and a half apart. So they're sort of like more grommets to handle the tension of the lace. If you're somebody who likes the wider grommets to space them like an inch and a half to 2 inches apart, you're going to have fewer laces than I do. So it will vary by corset. So, you can't assume that you're going to have as many laces as I am. You may have more if you're taller, longer waisted. If you're doing a corset that is like a corset vest, if you're doing a corselet where it's just like a waspy waist trainer, under bust corsets, all of these are going to have fewer grommets, but you can do the fan lacing with all of those styles of corsets. So I'm going to go from side A through the grommet to side B, up through the grommet. Make sure everything's nice and smooth. Check my length. And pin in place. Okay. And do the same deal here. And remember, it's about consistency. So try and do the same order of your laces every time in terms of what's going over the top, what's going underneath. If you make an error on one lace, it is not the end of the world. Most people will not notice, and you will not experience any discomfort or any weird wear and tear on your corset lace. It will always look slightly tangled from the back, like something has gone awry at that position. So if you are like me and that would sort of make your brain uncomfortable, you want to check in and fix things. But if it doesn't bother you, it's not a big deal. There's no reason to stress out about it. So we have 2 grommet holes left, and Cake has decided to help. Hi, buddy. Hi. Hey, where have you been this whole time? Hey, Lovey. Okay. Yes, come here. Oh, okay. Hey, buddy, we're working right now. Can I put you someplace not on the project? Would that be okay? What do you think? Okay. Oh, no, you're not about that life. Please go over there. Thank you. Okay. Cake wanted to say hi.
Well, it was very nice to see him.
He is like just over at the side giving me such a grim look, like how dare I remove him from this corset and his fans on the screen. He knows you're there. So
Well,
we're
maybe he
going.
wants a faux corset for himself.
Maybe he does, the little rapscallion. Okay. All right. Because I'm recycling this corset lace, I have found a place where my lace has a little bit of like staining on it. Heavens knows what that is from. If I wanted to, I could like replace this with something that doesn't have staining, but I'm not worried about it. I think it's probably just a little dust or tea, given the color. I don't know how I would have gotten tea on the back of my corset, but I drink a lot of tea, so anything is possible. All right, last lace, and for me, I would say I made a little bit of an estimation error. I need to move all my laces slightly up because I don't have room at the end for this final lace. It's a little tedious, but will only take me a couple minutes. So I'm gonna move everything up ever so slightly.
I have a lace question while you're doing that.
Yes,
So I'm considering dyeing my laces, and I know you dye your laces. Do you
I
just use
do.
RIT dye and then that color keeper thing that they want to sell you? Or do you just use the
Um,
dye?
s- so if I'm using RIT on my laces, I just use the dye. I don't bother with the color keeper. It's not going to get washed. It's a corset. It shouldn't get washed. And I'm not worried about the dye coming off on the corset. Maybe if I was doing like black laces against a white corset, I would be concerned. But in general, I'm not. Now, I mostly use Dharma trading dyes whenever I have them. They are more expensive and they are not as quick and easy to get, but the color selection is better, the quality is better. And if I can, that's what I use. I've used RIT plenty of times for my corset laces. It is fine, especially if I decide like at the last moment that I am desperate to dye my laces and I did not plan for it, which happens way more often than I'd like to admit. Um, but whenever I can, I use the Dharma, and that there's a whole process with those fiber reactive dyes. They will talk you through the different chemicals you need to have with them. It's not like a terrible process, but they do have a fixative that gets added to your dye process. And that means your dye is very stable. It will be brighter in color and it will last longer and better. And it will not run on your project. So, but yeah, the RIT, I don't get that dye fixative thing. I might do it if I was dyeing garments, but it would also depend on the color. Some colors are more notorious than others for, bleeding. Red, black are pretty notorious. Speaking of black, if you're like, oh, I really want black laces for my corset, buy black laces. I actually don't recommend dyeing things black if you can avoid it. It's really hard to get a good black. It's more expensive. So if you get good black dye from like Dharma, it usually takes 3 to 4 times the normal amount of dye to get a strong black. So that's not a big deal if you're dyeing a blouse, but if you're dyeing a coat, which I have done, it is a lot of dye and it gets really expensive. Richard the Thread has corset laces in black. I'm assuming that our dear friends at Corset Making also have corset lacing in black. But if you're going to do black, just get black fabric or black laces.
Yeah, I bought RIT dye because it was convenient.
Yeah, RIT is convenient. You can get it at Michael's or even sometimes at your grocery store. You may even be able to get it at Joann's if they've stocked their shelves.
Yeah. I got mine at
So
Joann's. Yeah, they happen to have it.
so sometimes when I go to Joann's, they've got all the dyes, but they are struggling. So their stocking is not as reliable lately.
Oh, yeah. My Joann's finally went back to their regular hours. That's how poorly staffed they were.
Oh
One
my
time I went
God.
to get pins and they had like 10 things in their notions aisle.
Yeah, they are struggling. And like, I will be honest, I'm not particularly sympathetic to the people who own the business because I think they have made poor business choices and forgot who their demographics are, and have not been serving their community. But I do feel bad for the employees because I think they're having a rough time. And I feel bad for us as a community of sewists because for a lot of people, Joann's is the main place you can go to get notions, supplies, emergency like last minute things you thought you had enough of and you ran out and you are facing a deadline. I also am a huge advocate for places like WowWack, that ships fast and has a beautiful selection of notions and great prices. So, and as far as I know, they treat their employees really well. I also am a little biased. WowWack occasionally sends me gifts of notions to try out and to to review. I'm not using any notions they sent me to review right now, but I do, and I generally am very delighted by their notions. So, okay, last one. Now I've moved everything up, very tedious, but you know what? Did not take me the end of the world to fix it. And so now I have just enough room for my last lace to go into position. And you can see that I had roughly 12 yards of lacing when I started, and I have roughly 12 yards. I have like roughly a yard and a half left. So somewhere in the 10 to 14 yards of lace will usually take care of most fan lacing for corsets. Again, it'll vary on the style of corset, it will vary on your personal needs, but I certainly would not have, I would have a minimum of 12 kicking around, so I have a little bit of flexibility with what I'm doing. So I've gone from side A to side B, got my corset lace in place. I've made sure it's nice and smooth. I'm going to check the length. Okay. Trim that last bit. So I'm taking side A to side B, putting it in place. Taking side B to side A and pinning it in place. Okay, so now my fan lacing is all in place. It's anchored. At this point, the danger zone is that any of this comes unpinned. So I'm really careful to make sure my pins are super secure, that I've used good pins, that I pinned everything very firmly. You don't really want your work to come undone while you're trying to like do the sewing portion and put in your belt. But our next steps are to create our belt pattern and decide what we want that belt pattern to look like, and then prep the belt to go on. So let me check our time and check in with all of you. Hello. Hello. It's good to see your face, Charity. Okay, so we're at about 12:30. So we're about an hour and a half into class. At the 2-hour point, we're going to take a little break. That will be your opportunity to get a snack, to get some tea or water. I will need a break so that I can be coherent and like answering your questions for the second half. So, this is one of my favorite things about the way I approach sewing these days. And that is, I believe in making your own patterns whenever you can. Because some stuff is so small and so easy that you can make that pattern for yourself. You don't need Bacalls or McCall's or Mutterick or Butterick or whatever those companies are named, because apparently I can't remember, to tell you how to make a belt for your corset. You can do it. It doesn't require draping. It's not going to require a lot of math. It's just not, it's not a heavy duty bit of patterning, but it's a great entry point to show yourself that you have all the skills you need to make some patterns for yourself without taking like a fancy class or anything like that. This is a class. I don't consider it a fancy class. Okay. Charity, I love seeing your baby cat there. Hello, baby cat. I love all those cats. So I will show you. Let's see if I can show this to you before we go into the patterning. So there we go. Oops. This is always a nice moment to be like, hey, does it work? Yeah, it will work. it's easier on your body because you need to be able to like pull things, but that is how that bloody works. And I love the magic. And you can see how gorgeous it looks as you pull it across and those laces open up. And you have that gorgeous fan of laces up and down your corset. So that is what we are creating. That is what you are doing right now. Okay. And then you just pull it and your laces go back into position. Okay. So let's talk about creating our pattern. This is a great time to have a tape measure. I love a seam gauge, and I love having a ruler. These are like my essential tools for making any sort of pattern. And I say that, and then my seam gauge is not in my kit where it should be. Seam gauge. It's all right. I'm going to put my little bodkin away because notoriously I lose my bodkins and then I'm very sad. So this is your opportunity to check like the dimensions of what you want your belt to be when you're done. So this is about 4 inches wide, 4¼ back here. So I want the base of my belt to kind of be 4¼ I have a little bit of flexibility because the base of my waist tape varies into this bone casing that I have here. And so if I wanted to make it more like 5 inches at the base, that would work out. And then it would just sort of move into that 4½ and get smaller as I go. The narrow portion of my belt here is also roughly 1¼ wide. So I probably want the narrow part of my belt for this long tongue of the belt on my fan lacing to be about 1¼ wide. So let's set this aside for the moment. And let's make a pattern. This is my Swedish tracing paper, and I have developed an absolute obsession with this stuff. I find it really fun and easy to work with for creating patterns. It is something where if I'm doing a kind of pattern where I need to sew it together to make sure that everything's even and working and going to shape the way I want to. The Swedish tracing paper is sewable. It's also slightly sheer, which I find super helpful. I used to use drafting vellum to create my patterns, and it works a treat because it's kind of sheer. It has a nice hand to it. It doesn't tear on you as you're working with it, unlike the onion skin paper that the big 3 pattern companies use. But it's actually more expensive to get the paper these days. The Swedish tracing paper, which is actually like more like a fiber that feels a little bit like fabric, is cheaper currently. So you can see that cheapness is very critical in my calculus. I'm just going to cut off a hunk of this. When I'm working with something like this that curls, I turn it so the curl is lying against my drafting table. It makes it a little easier to work with. I also usually put out a couple of pattern weights just to keep it smooth and flat while I'm working. So here's the thing. Normally when I'm working for myself, with myself, and I don't have people watching what I'm doing, I use a number 2 pencil for this sort of thing. But you will not be able to see a number 2 pencil. So I'll be doing a lot of my pattern drawing out of Sharpie so you can see what I'm doing. But I recommend using a number 2 pencil or a Frixion pen, something that you can erase as you are working in case you don't like how something looks, so that you can make sure that you have a clean pattern to work with. But Sharpie is very visible. So oh my gosh. Now I love a clear ruler for doing any sort of pattern work. And I am very keen on all of these gorgeous rulers and grids that come from the quilting section. Quiltists have a lot of great tools. I love their tools, and I'm not ashamed to use them. This is probably way longer than I need my belt to be, but I'm going to be honest, I tend to draft the pattern long because it's easy to trim off as I need. It's a lot harder to add fabric after the case. So this hunk that I cut off is 20 inches long. I should not need something quite that long. I am going to just center my ruler and basically pick a point, make a little mark. That is going to be the top edge of my belt. I've lined it up with my grid. So now I'm going to measure down. I decided 5 inches is what I want the base to be. So I'm going to measure 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, make a little mark. That is the finished width that I want my belt to be. I'm going to start by drafting the length and width that I want it to be without seam allowances, and then I will add in the seam allowance after. So now I'm finding my midpoint of my 5-inch width, and that is 2.5 inches, right? And make sure I'm not hallucinating. Okay, and I'm going to give myself a little line as a guide so that as I'm working, I can try and be symmetrical. And I just make a line straight down the center of this belt. Okay. So this is my guide to help me keep sort of organized and symmetrical. I said that I wanted my belt, the long tongue of it, to be about 1 inch, 1.25 inches wide. So I'm going to give myself a little over 1 inch for my, or a little over 1/2 inch. So this is like 5/8 of an inch from my center line. And I'm going to draw another long line all the way down my project. This is half of my belting, right? And then I'm going to mirror that on the other side. I like a kind of narrow tongue on my belt. I think it looks nicer. I think it lies nicer under my corset, but, or under my garments. But honestly, this is aesthetics at this point. It's what you think will look nice on your corset and what will work with your hardware. I have an inch wide buckle that I'm going to be using for my project. So I want it to kind of work with that buckle. And I like this style of buckle well enough for this kind of thing. But if you wanted to do two buckles, if you wanted to do a wider buckle, if you wanted to do something with snaps or hooks and eyes, as you get comfortable with making this and creating your own, you can actually decide what you want your belt to look like to match with the vibe of your corset. And we're steampunk costumers and time travelers, historical costumers, all of those things. Honestly, my friends, you'll let your whimsy guide you for this. You can have fun with it. Okay, so now I'm going to come over here to my little hash mark that is my outer edge. I'm going to decide how much of an angle and how long do I want the sort of broad end of my belt to be? Do I want it to be short? Do I want it to only like have a really steep angle and be kind of a short little base? Do I want a long base with a less steep angle? I can please myself on this. It's aesthetics. It's not functionality. And even if you want, you can go in with your curve and be like, oh, what I really want is a nice curve shape to that belt. If you don't have like a French curve or something like that in your workshop, plates work beautifully to give you a nice curved edge. Record albums, if you're like an audiophile, all of that works really well. So whatever I decide, I make sure to create a point on my tongue so that I'm like being symmetrical. You always want to, or at least I always want to be symmetrical. You may be doing a design where you're like, no, symmetry is a monster. I refuse. I'm going to have asymmetry in my belts. As long as your laces are set up on your anchor in a symmetrical fashion, it doesn't matter what your belt looks like. It just has to be big enough to contain the anchor. All right, so now I've got a shape that I'm happy with. I'm going to mark some things. This is the top. This is the bottom. It's pretty symmetrical, so in my case, it doesn't matter as much. But if yours is asymmetrical, you're doing anything fascinating with it, you will definitely want to mark top and bottom. I like to mark top and bottom because even though I've tried to be symmetrical, there are probably some slight differences between top and bottom. And that way, when I'm cutting it and prepping it for each side, I can make sure to mirror my pattern piece in the proper orientation. Okay, so now I've got my pattern piece, my shape. I'm happy with it. I think I'm happy with it. Maybe I actually want this to be shorter. Oh, more. No, I think I'm happy with it. I think that looks good. Okay, so now I'm going to add in my seam allowance. It's really easy for the tongue portion because I just come in with my straight edge and I'm going to give myself a 1/2 inch seam allowance. I'm just going to draw that on top of that long, narrow tongue, and I'm going to do the same thing for the bottom edge. Now, gets a little bit more complicated depending on how you handled this portion. I used a slight curve to mine, so I can't really come in here with my straight edge and get it to line up and give me a consistent seam allowance. So I will need to do something else. And depending on your style of curve, you may have a mark on your curve where it tells you like, that's the 1/2 inch mark and you can go in and use your curve for that. But what I normally do at this juncture is I use my seam gauge. So I'm going to go find a seam gauge since mine was not in the kit. I'll be right back. I leave you with this kind of abstract design. It's fixed. Good, thank you. I realized that while I was doing this, um, I forgot to spotlight myself for the entire first half of the class. So I apologize. I hope I was large enough on your screen. It does mean that I will not be spotlighted in the video. So my verbalization is going to be really important. I am so sorry, you guys. I will spotlight myself for the sewing construction. So, how ridiculous. Okay. Let's try that. Oh my gosh. All right. So, at this point, we're going to be talking about fabric and construction. We're also going to be taking a break in about 10 minutes. So let me show you what my other two corsets look like. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the differences in the fabric I chose and the way I constructed those belts, because you get to decide. This is your point to be like, this is what I want. These are the pros and cons. This is the fabric I have in my stash or the fabric I purchased specifically for this corset. I want you to understand the choices you're making and why I made the choices I did. So this is a single layer corset like the mesh one. And there's a lot of fun stuff going on with this corset. I love it. I wear it a lot. I wore it pretty exclusively until I made the rainbow corset. It's still one of the most comfortable corsets I've ever made for myself. I will wear it until it falls apart. It's really great. And when I did the belt for it, the bottom layer that rides against the corset is out of coutil, and the top layer is out of silk. And so it's 2-layer belt. That's all that's going on. And then there's like this big anchor inside. So it's kind of like bulky back here by the edge. But no one's feeling up my corset belt, right? No one knows that except for me. So it's fine. It was pretty easy to sew because it's not that many layers. And so I was able to get through it with a size 14 needle without trouble. I wish that I had fused some interfacing to this silk and made it a little bit more stable than I did. But other than that, I was super happy with how it turned out. It's nice and slim underneath my clothes when I'm wearing my corset. This guy is a way more heavy duty corset. This is a double layer corset. I made it during the last corset class we did last year, and we did a double layer style corset. So that's why I wanted to do a double layer style corset. It also has like all this applique and nonsense on it. So like in some places it's quite hefty. It weighs about twice as much as the single layer corsets. And because I thought that my belt was a little bit maybe too loose and soft on that red and black corset, decided to make my belt for this one very burly. It's actually 2 layers of coutil with a layer of coutil that's visible on the bottom. And then this applique is actually sewn on to another layer of coutil. Plus it's applique. There's so many layers of fabric in this guy. I had to use a size 16 sewing needle to get through all these layers. And I had to finish the top edge with hand sewing because my sewing machine was like, too many layers at that point. I refuse to go through that. So it's nice and sturdy, but it was a little bit toothsome to sew through, and it's a little bit bulkier under my clothes. So that was like the trade-off. The other thing I did with this that I do frankly consider a bad choice is that I made the tongue a separate piece, and then I just stitched it into the applique. It pulled out the first time I fan laced my corset, and I had to go in and fix that tongue. So if you want to do a sort of applique situation where you're layered, make sure that your tongue is not just tacked in with a small number of stitches. You want to reinforce this area because it's going to be taking a lot of your tension as you're pulling your fan laces. I gave myself a couple of rows of stitching, which you can see are visible in the back, but I did not plan very well in advance, or I would have made that reinforcement more integral to the design. So these are things to keep in mind as you are designing your belt. If you have questions about designing your belt, if you're doing that while we are working together today, please, this is a great opportunity to share your ideas, to talk about what you're thinking about doing, to get some feedback, to check in with your classmates to see what they think about your design and if they have any suggestions for you if you're like questioning your design. But if you're just following along and planning to make yours later, please ask questions in our corsetry group. I will be sending out a link to that via however you registered. So if you registered through Ticket Leap, you're going to get an email later with an invite to the Facebook corsetry group, and later you'll get a link to the video once it's edited and posted on YouTube. Welcome back. Please let me know that you are back. Hello, Martha. Thank you. Hi, Becky.
Hello.
Hello. Thank you for sharing the links and everything, Andy. Appreciate it. Hello, Shannon. Hey, everybody. Hello, Sarah. Hi. Thanks for letting me know you're here. I am definitely now having a hot flash just in time for us to get back. I'm so happy it happened right now and not 20 minutes ago. That was sarcasm. Anyway, we're going to get into cutting our fabric and prepping our belts and creating it. And so I want to talk a little bit about materials, supplies, and also belt buckles. So we're going to start there. I'm going to cut out some fabric, and then we're going to move into the rest of the workshop to the sewing machine, and we're going to do some stitching. So, and Cake is going to help for a minute. So there are all sorts of buckles out in the universe, and I have to admit that I haven't found a buckle that's like the perfect buckle yet. It's ephemeral, it's elusive. I feel like it's sort of my white whale of this particular project. But the buckle style I found that I like best so far is this kind of slider buckle. You can find them anywhere you find findings for making purses and bags because they are usually in that section of your store. I got mine from WowWack. They were not very expensive. They're very well made and they function perfectly for what I need. I will show you how to sew one of these in because the first time I did it, I made a mistake. So it's very easy to sometimes make mistakes. But essentially, this little slider bar actually slides across and locks your belt into position once you have it all aligned. So when you pull your belt tongue through, then you push this to the side and it's locked. So you don't need to make holes in your belt. If you are somebody who prefers to have holes and a tooth in your buckle to like slip into those little belt holes and hold it in that way, I recommend getting out your grommet kit and setting in some small grommets to be those holes for the tongue on the buckle. It's more effort. It's a little bit fussier to do it that way, but you want your belt holes to be really strong. You don't want them to fail on you. So if you are going to do something with like a belt that has holes and a tongue on the belt buckle, make sure you are reinforcing those holes. You can use eyelets, you could use grommets. I tend to be a grommets girl. I like that extra surety of the grommet. You could, if you love to hand sew, you could absolutely go in and hand finish all of your holes with a nice buttonhole stitch. That is more time than I want to personally take, but would absolutely work. So there are lots of ways to make those holes if you choose to go that direction, but do make sure you are reinforcing the holes. It would be really unfortunate to be wearing your corset and have your buckle fail and your corset starts unlacing itself while you're wearing it under your clothes. So terrible, terrible little wardrobe malfunction. If you don't want to do holes and you don't trust the style of buckle I'm using, hello, pussycat. Hello. I love the harness. So good. Oh my gosh.
She's styling.
She
right
is
now.
styling. And Bucky's here also wearing some clothes. Oh, look at all these stylish babies. Oh my gosh, Bucky. Hello. Bucky is Sarah Jane's kitty. He is very sweet and opinionated. So, another style of buckle you could use if you can find them are this style. These are actually created to go in gentlemen's waistcoats or waistcoats from like 19th century historical reenacting kind of perspective. They're very HA. They're super about that historical look. This is more of the historical style for those little beltings that go in the back of a waistcoat. And so it has teeth on it. And you can see these two little sharp guys, they kind of bite into your belt. And then this little metal bit secures them so your belt will not go anywhere. But it can be hard on your fabric. So keep that in mind. They're effective, but they may chew up your fabric. And if they get positioned wrong, you have two sharp teeth that could be digging into your corset. Now, they probably won't get all the way through the coutil and the busk into your flesh beneath, but I would proceed with caution with this style. It is an option. The mistake I personally made, to be honest, the first time I did this, I got this style of buckle because I thought it looked really cool. It's like the silver buckle with the single slider, but it has two. And so getting everything aligned just so that the slider still works was really hard. But the other hard part of it is so hard to thread my belt into this when I'm putting on my corset. I spend more time getting my belt tongue through this bloody buckle than I do putting my corset on, and it always frustrates me. So I don't recommend this style, even though it looks really cute. You can also use something like this. This is more of the modern style of buckle that goes on the back of waistcoats in that belting, and it has like little teeth on either side. They're not going to poke through the fabric. They will put some wear and tear on the fabric, but they will generally hold your belting pretty strongly in place. It's not going to slide in and out. I like the silver kind best because it's not going to put wear and tear on my fabric, and I think it holds a little bit more firmly. But there are lots of buckles out there. There are quick release buckles. Those would absolutely work too. They're a little bulkier than I want under my clothes. But, if you're not vain and tight lacing all the time like I am, then maybe you've got some ease under your garments and you can wear a quick release belt. So what I'm getting at is the belt buckle is something where you can please yourself. There is no right answer for the world. There's only the right answer for you individually. Make sure that your belt buckle will fit on the width of tongue you have drafted. However, if you need to make your tongue get a little bit narrower, you can do that. You're in control. You can adjust your pattern to fit the hardware you have. You can get more hardware if you want. I like to use stash stuff whenever I can. So everything I'm using today for this project was in my stash. Because I make corsets all the time, I always have some bits of corset coutil kicking around. That's a privileged position. I know most people don't have coutil in their stash. I love coutil again because it's strong and it's thin, and so it doesn't make for a bulky finish. But twill, canvas, duck, denim, all of those things are pretty strong and they will work as the underlayer for this if you don't have access to corset coutil. It's not doing the work of shaping your body. It just needs to be strong enough to hold up against pulling the laces into position. I like coutil because it's less bulky, but canvas, duck, denim, those are all very strong fabrics. A nice cotton twill would also work. I kind of preference natural fibers because I live in the desert and it gets hot as blazes out here. So I like things to breathe, but the belt is a very small portion of the garment. So if you're using a bunch of synthetic fabrics, it's not going to really add to the heat index of your garment here. Okay. So the other thing I'm using is the remaining silk from having done the binding and the boning channels from this corset. So I want my belt to kind of match my existing corset trim, and I'm fortunate to have scraps left over from that. I don't have a lot of scraps, so I'm going to have to cut carefully and with thought when I am approaching this. This is a ribbed taffeta from Silk Baron. I got it because of the ribs. I thought it had a really nice look to it. Also, I felt like it was a little bit stronger than what I'd used the first time. I am going to also cut some interfacing to fuse to this fabric to give it a little bit additional strength without making it too much bulkier. So I'm going to do one layer of coutil, one layer of silk fused with interfacing to create my belt. If you're like, ooh, the fabric I want to use is very thin, and I'm not sure that interfacing is going to be enough to make it strong enough to hold up to the levering motion, pulley action of pulling those laces into position, you may want to flatline your fashion fabric to a bit of cotton muslin or another layer of twill or a layer of coutil if you have it. Keep in mind, for every additional layer you add to this belt, you are adding thickness to that portion of your corset, and you are adding thickness to the seams when you stitch them. So keep that in mind. I am preferencing thinness over strength here because I want my fabric to not be too bulky, so it's a little easier to sew. But also, this is not the corset I wear all the time. It's not the corset that is under every garment. I wear it occasionally when it's hot because it is lightweight and soft, and very comfortable. But my heavy duty corsets have heavier duty belts. So keep that in mind. It also can depend on how you're using it and what your plan is. All right. If you've never worked with coutil, the grain is really obvious in coutil, and you should cut with the grain for this. You don't want it to be cut on the bias for the foundation layer. You can do whatever you want for the fashion layer because the foundation layer will keep it from stretching. But if you cut your foundation section of this belt on the bias, it will stretch on you. And you do not want your belt to stretch out while you're wearing it. You want it to stay nice and firm so that when you get yourself laced into your corset, you're not slowly getting looser and looser under your garment. The nice thing about coutil is that it often has a very visible grain. My coutil is all herringbone style with no pattern or design in it that is obscuring the the grain. And so it's very easy for me to line everything up with the grain and to make sure it fits. I had pressed this in advance. It's got a little wrinkle from where I folded it out of the way, but I recommend pressing your stuff, at least the foundation, so you get a nice crisp cut on it. And then I like to use a rotary cutter with my coutil. But use the cutting tool that works best for you. I'm a big advocate for rotary cutters though, because they kind of save my hands. If you're working with coutil, I try to use pins as infrequently as possible with coutil. Well, really, if I'm being strictly honest, I use pins as little as possible, period, because pinning takes time. Pinning puts holes in your fabric. Pinning puts strain on your hands. Anything to like avoid pinning and still get the effect I want is what I do. If you are worried about making sure that everything is just so on your fabric, you can cut a layer at a time rather than doubling up. But for this kind of thing, I double up. I am not fancy cutting. I'm not pattern matching. I'm not worried if it's like 1/8 of an inch off, because this is not a corset. It is not shaping my body. It's not going to affect my comfort level if it's cut slightly off grain. However, for ease of demonstrating what I'm doing so you can see, I am going to trace my pattern onto this fabric because it's white on white. It'll be really hard to see what's going on. Oops. So here I've got my pattern piece laid out on my coutil. My coutil is laying with the grain going perpendicular to, I'm sorry, rather parallel to the edge of my table. Makes it really easy. This is a scrap I just had kicking around. So I'm just going to make sure that I'm cutting sort of as economically as possible so I can save a bigger chunk of scrap for future projects. I'm pretty generous with my pattern weights. I have a lot of pattern weights. I love pattern weights. They're very handy. I find them super handy in corset making, but really I use them in all of my garment making. So just coming in and tracing around my pattern with my Sharpie. Incidentally, if you are worried about accuracy in your cutting, if you are worried about accuracy in your fit, if you're having a hard time just pinning or putting pattern weights down and cutting, you can always trace and then cut. It's kind of more tedious, but as long as you can draw a steady line, which I'm having a bit of trouble with, tracing can lead to greater accuracy. But it's not necessary. We're not a tailor shop. We're not a bespoke shop on Seville Row. We're doing a very non-structural part of the garment. So now that I've got this traced, I'm going to just cut around it with my rotary cutter. If you've never used a rotary cutter before, there are some tricks. Cut away from yourself or cut across your body from dominant side to non-dominant side. Make sure that you are keeping your fingers out from under the blade. Do not cut your finger with the blade. Use the rotary cutter as though it's an extension of your arm, whatever style you're using. I like this style because I like the Kai. It has a really nice feel to it. And it's got good safety features, but there are lots of styles of rotary cutters in the world, and you should find the kind that feels nice in your hand. At this juncture, if your fabric is woody, you can still just have your little pattern weights down too. When I trace, I just cut directly on that tracing line. Oh, fabric, come on. There we go. With a rotary cutter, you want to start a little bit before your cutting line so that the blade is engaged by the time you hit your line. Okay. So
I have a
now
quick question.
yes. Yes,
So
Martha.
the at the end of the triangle area, is that going to
Mhm.
be a hem, or is it just going to be unhemmed
It,
or whatever?
oh no, it will get hemmed. Well, it will get stitched so that the raw edges are tucked away.
Okay.
So yeah, that raw edge will not be out loose in the world. That would be a bad scene. So depending on what you're doing with your project, you may have to turn it by hand and then hand stitch the closure on this. My hope, like I was able to do it by machine when my belting was not too thick because my machine is pretty burly. But if your machine is like a lightweight machine, you'll probably have to finish this portion by hand. It will be the last part of creating the belt is like sewing this portion. At least the way I am doing it right now. But yes, it does get turned over, it does get stitched, it gets encased in the belt. You'll see with the silk, that's really important because silk frays like mad. I'm going to put this to the side. I only need one set of those. If I was using coutil to make a double layer situation with 2 layers of coutil, I would cut 2 of these guys. So now this is my fashion fabric. And I do not have an infinite amount of this fabric. And so I'm going to have to think about my cutting on this because if you notice, it is too long going one direction and going the other direction is like, will just fit. However, there are ribs on my silk. And so if I cut it this way, my ribs are going to go the opposite direction of how they go on my corset boning channels. Now, a lot of people would not notice that. It would be no big deal to them. I will notice because I have OCD. But if I make an intentional choice, it won't necessarily bother me as long as I plan to do it and don't like do it willy-nilly. The other option for me on my fashion fabric is actually to cut it on the bias because it is the fashion fabric. I am not worried about this layer stretching or not stretching. Also, I'm going to interface it. It's going to be really strong. And like, I kind of love having those ribs going on an angle because they go on an angle in my bias binding. So it kind of picks that concept up from the binding. And like for my original belt that is embedded in the corset, it is matching the ribs of the boning channels. So I kind of don't want to suddenly have ribs going perpendicular to that. So I think I'm going to do a bias just to make it work. Although this is also a good opportunity to be like, do I even need to worry about that? How long is this belt by comparison to my corset? Well, you guys, I can definitely trim off a little bit there. So let's see if it fits now. Great. I know this is fussy and kind of like can seem like a little arcane, but when you're making something for a beautiful corset, whether it's one you constructed yourself or it's one you bought, you kind of want to make sure that all of your cutting and patterns are where you want them to be, because it's really hard to undo things. So if I shorten my belt, as I discovered I could, it will just fit on my fabric with the ribs going the same way as they go on the original like embedded belt for the waist tape and on the boning channel casings. So that's what I'm going to do. This is my choice. Okay. Now, here's the thing about silk. Silk frays. It frays a lot. You can see that my original cutting, I used a serrated blade. I really recommend using a serrated pinking style blade for cutting silk to cut down on the fraying. I have a seam in my tabletop. Whenever I hit it with the rotary cutter, the cutter always skips. It's kind of irksome, but at this point, I'm just like, yes, I've hit the seam. But that's why you'll often see I have to go back in and catch like an inch or a quarter of an inch to like fix where it cut. So now I've got my silk cut, and it's time to cut some interfacing. You'll see that I'm keeping all of my belt pieces in the same color scheme as my corset. That's just the aesthetic I wanted to go with. You should do the aesthetic that you like, that works for you. I am, however, going to take this little finger pressed crease in my coutil and cut my belt shorter. I'm going to mirror that.
I apologize. I think I may have missed this previously. Are we supposed to be matching the length to the length of our corset?
Oh, that's a great question, Shannon. So I just make mine really long and then I trim it as I need to. So which is a kind of loosey-goosey answer. But you want to make your belt long enough that it will wrap around to the front and give you a little bit of a tongue. And so it's a good idea to measure and make sure that with your laces, you're coming pretty far around to the front of your corset, but it doesn't have to be as long as your whole corset sides because the laces are going to pull into position. There's probably some math there that I'm not good at. You can see that my belt is shorter than each side, but one side is longer because that's the tongue that goes through my buckle. I cut them and construct them the same length. Then I put my corset on and I figure out where I want my belt to end, and then I trim it and tuck that little end in and machine stitch it on the end. But yes, that's a good question.
Thank you.
I started out with a belt that was as long as the side of my corset. Does that help?
It does.
I
Thank you.
hope. You're welcome. That's a really good question because I did not mention it. I just moved merrily along. So I just happen to have some fusible black interfacing kicking around. I suspect lots of us have interfacing in our workshops. If you use it, you sort of end up with a little bit of it always left over. In this case, I have a lot of it because I bought a bunch in 2020 for mask making. And I don't normally use fusible interfacing for my projects. So just going to cut 2 pieces of fusible interfacing to fuse into my silk to keep this silk nice and sturdy and to help prevent some fraying. Although you can see the little zigzags of my rotary blade are doing a good job at preventing some fraying. Use my coutil as my little pattern here because it's nice and sturdy. Again, I'm just going to come in with my little pattern weights. Currently, I'm just starting by cutting my fusible interfacing the same width as my pattern. Feel like I'll never need fusible interfacing again because I bought like 10 yards of this. And it is a nice quality interfacing. So it's working out for those little projects I need interfacing for, but also it's kind of funny because I don't normally use interfacing. Okay, so, or at least not fusible. So now that I have cut out my fusible, I'm going to go in and I want to trim it down on all edges about a 1/2 inch. You can kind of eyeball this. I normally do. If you are concerned about your ability to eyeball it, you can go in and measure and mark it, but you want to cut it so that it's not running into your seam allowance too much. You want to keep that seam allowance from getting too bulky. So you just want to add stability to the belt without adding too much bulkiness to your seam allowance. Doing my ends first. I have my little interfacing layers stacked. You're basically pre-grading your seams. All right, so now this is ready to be fused to the silk and my belt is ready to be constructed. So we are going to move into the other room. We're going to do a little bit of pressing and we're going to do a lot of stitching. I like to get all of my pieces just kind of lined up together, ready to travel. This is Jean-Luc, one of my shop cats. Hi, baby. And this is Masala, who's also helping today. The kitties are always here. Hi, Masala, you're on the ironing table. There you go. So when I'm fusing something like this, where the pieces look kind of identical, I usually lay them both out on my table, mirrored, so I make sure I'm fusing the correct sides and I'm not accidentally fusing them so that I have two of the same side. I like to make sure my fabric is nice and smooth before I do my fusing, so I usually give it a quick press. If you haven't worked with silk before, silk can take a lot of abuse. Honestly, it likes the heat. It likes the steam. You don't have to use a delicate iron on silk. It's a wonderful insulator. It's actually great with high heat. Hi, Masala. Are you helping? Here, come here. Oh my gosh. Oh my goodness. She never makes an appearance, so hello. What's going on? Who's a good girl? Are you helping with class? Okay. All right. You want to go over here so you're not in the way of ironing? I don't want to iron your tail. Okay, yes.
No,
Okay.
mommy, I just want to be right in the picture.
She does, which is like so unusual. Normally she's kind of a shy girl. Masala was a pandemic kitty. So she is like not super used to humans in the way that my boys are. Okay, no, Masala, you're so cute. You're so in the way. What are we gonna do with you? Yeah, okay. You do need a cuddle? In all of the classes I've done, all of the workshops, this is the most of an appearance Masala has ever made. So on one hand, I'm sorry for the interruption. On the other, I'm somewhat delighted. Hi, buddy.
I can ask some questions while she's getting her snuggles.
That would be great. Please ask some questions.
Okay, so if we wanted to do fan lacing for an underbust corset, should we do it the way we did it for the overbust corset, or just do it like half a one?
Oh, you would
You
do
know?
it exactly. Yeah, you would do it exactly the same as you do it for the overbust corset. You would start at the waist and you'd work up and work down the same way. So it would be roughly the same, except you'd have fewer grommet holes, and so you'd have slightly fewer runs of lacing, but it's the same process.
Yeah, because it would be more like a shorter on the top and longer on the bottom.
Probably.
For
Yeah,
mine.
because I'm long-waisted, to be honest, mine is longer on the top almost always and shorter on the bottom. Um, for somebody who's 5'3", I got a lot of torso, like I'm a person who's 5'8". So I have to buy tall tops and short bottoms. Hey, what is going on, buddy? She's still like kind of clingy. So yes, but good question, because it will look a little bit more compact on an underbust corset, but also you aren't going to have as many laces to work into the anchor, so that's kind of nice.
Okay. And then I went ahead and bought the sliding belt buckle like
Yes.
you have. And I
Yes.
bought the other kind with the grommet just in case that didn't pan out. And
Yeah.
so my question was regarding the one for the back of a vest. If I
Mhm.
decide to try that at some future point, did you get that at Wawak?
So the standard back of the vest one I got at Wawak. the kind that has the little metal teethy bits
Yep.
that stick out. I got that at a historical reenactors uh mercantile, and
Okay.
I think it's Joss Townsend and Sons. I will pull up that link um and share it in the corsetry group. So I do not do and have not done 18th century recreation, even though I love paniers and I love a big wig, like everybody. They're great. But I had very dear friends for a long time that was the thing they did, and they turned me on to Joss Townsend. And so it's like a lot of, do you want to have the exactly historical recreation of the buckles that went on shoes so you can be perfect for being at Colonial Williamsburg? Here you go. This is the place for it. So it's a little bit, fussy in that way, but sometimes the findings, the buttons and everything are really nice because they are metal or bone or wood and not plastic. And they will have these arcane things like that weird little buckle with the teeth in it. So,
Yeah. Because I have a couple of vests that the with the newer kind of buckles on them, and they just don't do anything.
so honestly, I no longer make waistcoats that need a buckle and back because we've transitioned the Grand Arbiter into having corset waistcoats. But when I was making him waistcoats with those kinds of belts, I hated the modern buckle. I did find it didn't work super well, especially because usually that belting in back of the waistcoat is kind of like slick and thin, and it just doesn't want to grip. So those teeth do a great job for that. Um, but I sort of switched early for Glenn into doing something that laces in back just to avoid that problem. But if you are doing waistcoats, you want a good buckle, I recommend that style. So,
Okay.
all
I
right.
had one last question, sorry.
Yeah. No,
Um,
don't apologize for questions.
so earlier you showed us your 1 inch buckle, and
Yes.
then you said you were making a 1 1/4 inch belt.
Yeah, no, I
So
did
do you
bad
typically
math.
make it a little bigger than the
No,
belt buckle?
no, no, no. No, I should have made it narrower. I did bad math. It should be, I'll probably have to go in and trim the width at the end of my tongue to make it a little narrower to wrap through my buckle. But I can sort of like grade it down to take it down to an inch from an inch and a quarter. But yeah, no, my math was wrong. It's a good observation. You should do your the tongue of your belt so that it will fit comfortably in your buckle without being bunched up and weird.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Great question. I always appreciate when you're like, wait, you said this thing and it doesn't make any sense. And I just want to confirm that you realize that you said this nonsensical thing and you meant it, or did you realize you had not said something that made sense? Please always ask me to clarify. Especially if I'm having a hot flash, I'm probably like deranged in that moment and don't know what I'm saying. So,
I did figure out why you're having the hot flash.
oh my
It's
God,
it's
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 just
because you have the moth earrings,
oh,
right? And they're attracted to bright
flame.
lights, which are hot.
That's why. Oh my gosh, that's great. So I'm just doing the standard fusing on my fusible. I will say that it's a really good idea when you're doing fusible interfacing, follow your instructions. Whatever they tell you to do, that's what you should do. But once you've got it fused, you should actually let it sit for a few minutes to settle in to the adhesive and to let it cool a little bit so it sort of cures. If you move it around too much while it's hot, it may not immediately start peeling up, but it interrupts the process of the fusing and that adhesive really sticking to your fabric. Try not to melt your glasses while you are doing it. You'll also see that instead of sliding my iron along, I actually pick it up and move it into the next portion that I'm fusing. And that is intentional because then I'm not sliding my interfacing around while I'm fusing it into position. I'm just putting the heat on that position directly down. So it's a nice, strong hold. And listen, just because I don't use fusible very often, there's no crime in fusible interfacing. The big thing is it will change the hand of the fabric. It will make it less soft of a drape. It will make it stiffer. And sometimes that's what you want. For me, pretty often, it's not what I want. I want to maintain my soft drape. I want to maintain the hand of the fabric. There we go. So that's why I often don't use fusible and will use sew-in interfacing instead. But fusible is great because it's fast. And for something like this, it adds the kind of stiffness and the kind of, firmness to the fabric that I want in this particular case. It's perfect for creating a belt, in other words. So I'm going to let this sit for a minute and cool. And I'm just going to give my coutil a little quick press since I pressed it and then folded it and put more wrinkles into it when I folded it. So I need to just smooth those out. Hi, Kate. Hi, Jean-Luc. Hey, everybody. We're going to get more of a floor show from the cats. There you go, Jean-Luc. Okay, Cake. There you go.
They're such sweet babies.
Thank you. They are good babies. And also they're like, okay, listen, you've been teaching this class for several hours. I'm going to need treats now. Thank you. They've worked so hard. They've knocked so much off onto the floor. Thank you, guys. Okay. So for something like this, the thread starts to matter when you get to the finishing. I have top stitched one belt. I thought it looked nice to do the top stitching to put that little edge stitch in to kind of reinforce it. On another belt, I didn't really top stitch it. It was fine. When we get to the finishing is kind of how you want your belt to look. So we'll talk about that once we've turned the belt and we're getting ready to install it. But when I'm doing this portion of the adventure, I just want whatever thread I'm sewing with to not be something objectionable that's going to show. Okay, Cake. I have a nice purple, but I don't have a lot of it. So I'm going to be using black thread for doing the internal stitching. What I want to do is stitch right sides together. I'm gonna make sure everything's lined up pretty nicely. And I'm just gonna clip my pieces together. I don't need to do heavy duty pinning or heavy duty clipping for this because it's not a super challenging shape and the fabric is not that woodgy. It's not moving around on me a lot. But if your fabric is slick, if it's a satin, if it has a sort of texture where it moves around on you a lot, it's important to have a kind of precision to your sewing. So I recommend pinning or clipping as much as you need to have control over what your fabric is doing. You want to be the boss of your fabric. Don't let your fabric boss you around, in other words. Or as we say in the temporal entourage, make it your butler. So I'm going to just sew along both sides at a 1/2 inch until I get towards the end of my tongue. And then I'm going to cheat and move into a 5/8 inch seam allowance in order to make it narrower because you know what? Martha is right. I cut this slightly too wide for my belt, but that is a way to cheat. When you just made it slightly too wide, you can increase your seam allowance and then trim away. Listen, no one knows what you've done internally, and you made the pattern. So they are not going to be able to tell if you've done some last minute adjustments like this. And there's no sewing Gestapo that's going to show up in your workshop and be like, I cannot believe you started at a 1/2 inch sewing seam allowance and moved to 5/8. What a crime against fabric. You are fine. So I want to do a 2.5 millimeter stitch. I'm doing a straight stitch. Check if you were sewing something where you had a zigzag stitch previously, for instance, you might want to make sure your machine is not set for a zigzag stitch. Why do I say that? Because I was, and I almost did that thing. So make sure your stitch is a straight stitch, it's a standard stitch length, and that your needle is in the center position. I'm using a size 12 needle for this portion, but when I turn the garment and I'm getting ready to finish it, I will probably size up to a 14 or a 16 because I'm going to be stitching over those laces and all of that as well. So here we are. Hopefully you got a good line of sight. And I've lined my edge up with my 1/2 inch mark on the plate of my machine. Drop my needle. I absolutely want to back tack. So make sure you give yourself a nice back tack there, especially because you're going to be turning this. Now I'm coming into the tongue of my belt. And what I want to do here, because I cut my belt slightly too wide, is I'm going to just start shifting into a 5/8 seam allowance. I'm going to back tack again. Now, I recommend always sewing in the same direction because that helps prevent any weird movement of your fabric under your presser foot. This is a long enough seam where the innate differential of tension will cause some movement. If you got a walking foot, you can also use your walking foot to prevent that kind of movement, but I'm not going to get a walking foot out for a project this size. I'm going to back tack. I'm sewing a 5/8 seam allowance here. Or I'm sorry, a 1/2 inch seam allowance here. And as I come into the tongue, I'm going to start moving into that 5/8 seam allowance. To make my tongue a little narrower. When I get to the ends, again, I'm just going to back tack, make sure everything's nice and sturdy. Now this all needs to get turned, but before I turn it, I'm going to trim away some of this seam allowance. I'm also going to snip along my curves. The other thing I want to do, however, before I get too far along, ow, is stab myself on some pins, apparently. I like to go in and do a basting stitch on my little anchor and all of these cords. So I am going to size up my needle. You see, I keep a lot of needles in the house. I like the organ needles and Schmetz. They're both great. It really is personal preference for the most part. Depending on what you've done with your belt and the shape and everything, this is a point where you may wish to press your seams before you turn it. I'm not too worried. This is not a super complicated, super involved belt that I have created, so I'm not going to worry about pressing the seams before I turn it. But pressing your seams does always make a more crisp finish and will also help set your stitches. So I also recommend don't press your seams until you're happy with what you've created. So it'll be a lot harder to unpick your seams. So what I'm going to do is take my little safety pin and I'm going to pin it through one seam of my belt about a 1/2 inch below the edge of the belt. So it's nice and secure and not going to disappear on me. And then I'm going to push it down into the tube. And we're gonna do a good job, Martha, because you talked me through last time. I'm so happy. Turning tubes and tubes are like the thing in sewing I find I am the least good at. So we made a joke of it last time, but the truth is I find it like it's not my strong suit. And I'm like a little chagrined by that, but also we all have our areas that are not our strengths in sewing. So it's okay.
I'll turn all your tubes if you'll sew all my buttonholes.
I will, actually. I love doing a buttonhole. So deal. All right, so now I'm pushing my pin in so that the head of the pin is pushing down away from me, and I'm pushing on the tail of the pin as it goes. And the way this works, that Martha explained so nicely last time, is that you want to get it started like an inch or two first. Just sort of like working a little bit into your tube. The interfacing makes it stiffer, so that's a thing to remember. Interfacing can make it a little harder to turn your tubes, but I stand by the choice, again, of using interfacing, even though I'm making my life harder, because long term, I'll make the garment nicer. So once I have got like a little bit going, a couple of inches into my tube, I should be able to grab that pin and start using it to feed my fabric into the tube so that it will turn like magic. I think this is being stiffer because it also has the coutil, which is very stiff fabric. There we go.
But we'd be sad if it wasn't stiff and it just got longer and longer while we were wearing it.
Yes, we would. That's absolutely true. So of all the things you want to prevent against with your belt is having it stretch on you, because you really will be like, I thought that this corset fit and it seems to be really loose. No, your belt is stretching. So you do want to guard against belt stretch. Um, the dread belt stretch. It's a new danger in the world of corsetry. So the nice thing is my tongue is not infinite. Once I get to this like opening, it's very easy to turn because it's a nice big opening at the end. But now I've got my little belt turned, ready. So nice shaped tongue that's going to fit much better on my buckle. And we're going to give it a press. And then we're going to install it. We're so close to having our belt in place and being done, which is very exciting. I always love this part of making any garment where I'm like, oh, there are like 2 steps left, and then it's ready. So great. It's also when I get the most like impatient to be done because I'm like, oh, I have 2 whole steps left and then I'm done. I want to have no steps left and be done. So we're gonna go give it a press because pressing is a good idea and we'll make it look better. And again, if you've got a fussy shape or you're feeling fussy, press it before you turn it. More pressing is actually usually better, but sometimes I'm an impatient girl. So I'm gonna go over, get this pressed nice and flat. It's always a bit crinkled from turning, and I don't want to leave it crinkled like that when I'm going in and edge stitching it and finishing it. So pressing is something I have not always been good about as a sewist. And when I got started in sewing, I was entirely self-taught. The internet did not exist yet, so I couldn't Google it. There was no YouTube videos to go check out. And I had friends I could ask occasionally by phone for help with things, but like long distance used to also cost a lot of money and they all lived away. So it was not something where I could just call a friend up or text them or get on like a messenger. I was really like reinventing the wheel a lot. And no one explained to me the value of pressing. No one told me why I would want to press or how it would improve my garments or change the fit. And so I was really lackadaisical about pressing for a long time, but the reality is a good press will elevate your garment. And so it will make it crisper. It will make sure that everything lines up properly. And it will also anchor those seams so that the stitches are embedded in your fabric and they're gonna not go anywhere. All of these are good things. So something I'm doing while we're chatting is I'm hand rolling my seams into position before I press. And like, honestly, pressing before I turned it would have given me a nicer effect. But, I was in a hurry. I wanted to get to the fun part of being done. So here we are. I have a nice hot steamy iron. I've got everything in position. I'm just going to go in and give myself a nice little press along those edges. So now this is actually ready to be placed over my corset laces. But one thing I'm going to do, I'm going to sniff this a little bit. So I'm actually going to go in here. I'm going to snip my seam allowance a little bit, sort of like I would trim a corner if I was turning a corner. I do that on both sides. So I'm just going to trim that at an angle like so. And now I want to take this end that's going to go over my laces, and I want to fold it under a 1/2 inch, ideally. I'm opening the seam up as I fold. When I am happy with how it's folded, I'm going to go in and give that a good press. Sometimes you have to do a layer at a time. Normally I can do it in one go, but it's very stiff at this juncture, so it's fighting me a little bit. Use your table to help you. Sometimes just having a nice flat surface to work against will help you fold and press things into place. You need to trim more. There we go. Making sure all of my raw edges are tucked under, looking nice and neat and tidy, hopefully. Now I'm going to go in and hit that with a nice hot steamy iron. Okay, nice raw edges not visible. It's exactly what I want. I've got all of this nonsense and I need to clean this up a little bit. So I'm going to cut my laces just a little bit. I don't want to cut them too close to the stitching, but I don't need that much bulkiness. So I cut them so they're all about a 1/2 inch longer than my basting stitch. And I'm actually now going to come underneath and trim away some of this anchor so it doesn't stick out of my belt. Cutting that down also to be about a 1/2 inch. Now I'm going to shape this anchor a little bit. I want to cut those corners off so it will fit nicely into my little belt cap. Open that up. And this guy just slides right in to my belt. Look at that. Wasn't that nifty? I just want to make sure it's slid in enough that my anchor is not showing on the underside. So I want it to be fully encased in my belt. Like so. I want to make sure all of my raw edges are tucked away. This is your chance to trim anything that needs trimming, to take a moment to make everything as lined up exactly as you want it. Like I've got this little bit that's sticking out, trim it. Keep it out of view, nice and tidy. Okay, so now this is ready to be top stitched. It's going to get top stitched right across this opening to get that all firmly encased. And if I'm like, ooh, that top stitching does not feel like enough, you can do a couple of rows of stitching, or you could do a nice double stitch with a double needle. But the idea is you just want this part to get stitched close. That is going to embed your laces in your belt. And once that's done, then we put the buckle on. So we're so close. Any questions before we move into the finishing?
So do you do that top stitch with the basting stitch again, or the regular length stitch?
If I can, I do it at like a 3mm length. So slightly
Okay.
longer than my standard stitch, but not as long as my basting stitch. However, if my many layers and the, laces are too burly to go under my needle at a length 3mm stitch, then I will move it up to that 4mm stitch because I would rather finish this with a machine than by hand. But if you like hand sewing, this is a great time for some hand finishing if you want to do that. But I like to do as much as possible by machine, which is why I'm a steampunk and not a historical reenactor. So I love hand sewing. I'm a big fan, but also I don't want to hand sew everything. So especially something like this, I want it to kind of be quick so I can wear it. Like I've made the whole corset. I don't want to wait around for a lot more time. I want to wear it. So I am putting
There were sewing machines in the Victorian era.
There sure were. The 19th century is all about the sewing machine, and I love that. Now, fan lacing was also used in the Regency on Regency stays. And I don't know if it was used earlier than that. I haven't done the research. But that was definitely done by hand because the sewing machine came into existence, I think, in the 1830s, late 30s, 1840s, something like that. But it was, as we all know, the sewing machine changed the world. I love that sewing machine. So we're gonna go up to my sewing machine and we are gonna stitch this. Look at how nice it looks. Yours is gonna look this nice too, by the way. Um, Mine just looks nice like this because I'm holding it up in front of the camera, but yours is gonna look cool like this too. So cannot wait to see you guys' fan lacing. So now is the time when my thread color matters. There are lots of ways to approach your thread color with your project. It doesn't have to match your fabric. A contrast can be so beautiful and can look very intentional and very decorative. So there are lots of times where I use contrast stitching as my top stitching on purpose, especially if I can't get a good match. I'd rather do a contrast than have something that's just slightly off in a way that everybody's like, ooh, that doesn't seem right. Um, the other thing I recommend, which I got as a recommendation from some really great sewing fabricators, is to use a color of thread that's slightly darker than your fabric rather than lighter. So if you can't get a perfect match, go darker because the shadow of the seam, even though it's like a tiny shadow, will actually make that darker color just feel like it's more of a shadow. And so it will help mask it if you can't get quite an exact match. Getting an exact match is not necessary for having a beautifully finished garment, but I am fortunate because I made this before and I, did a bunch of top stitching. I actually have the thread I used for it. I've got a good match. So I'm going to be using that. Oh my gosh. I'm just gonna move around in my workshop on my hair since it's like on wheels. Sometimes it moves around like a bumper car. I'm also going to use white thread in my bobbin so that the stitching on the underside of my belt sort of disappears into that belt. I shared during the recent tutorial that we did that until I had been sewing for quite a while, I thought there was some crime against using two different color of threads between your bobbin and your top thread. And so I was always like, oh, they have to match, right? No, they just need to be the same weight typically. So my machine is a little persnickety about thread. I have to use German thread on my Japanese sewing machine, something I find really amusing. Because the thread needs to go on the spool in a particular way. But honestly, the most important thing is to find thread you like that works for you. Also important is to thread your machine properly. Let's try this again. Oh, pardon me, everyone. My sewing machine is getting a little bit persnickety. Basically, I have to clean out my bobbin carriage before we can proceed. Hopefully that will take care of the problem, or we'll be switching sewing machines. Which, fortunately, I have a backup sewing machine, so not the end of the world. But between the time I was sewing 5 minutes ago and the time we spent ironing, my sewing machine is like, I don't want to thread your bobbin. Usually cleaning it will do the job. But usually I don't want to start cleaning my machine in the middle of a class. So thank you for your patience. When in doubt, though, if your machine is like being weird and persnickety about taking up your bobbin thread, go in, brush out the bobbin carriage, give it a quick little clean. 9 times out of 10, that will resolve the problem. On the 10th time that it doesn't work, well, that's when it's good to have a backup sewing machine, because then you may need to take it in to somebody professional. So I've had both of my Shinomis for 11, well, I've had this one for 11 years and I've had the other one for almost 30 years. And they're really good machines. I've been very happy with them. And normally I don't have much trouble with them. But on those occasions when I do, I'm always like the most frustrated because it's so reliable. I'm like, why now? Why? When we're in class, I didn't want to clean you out right now. Anyway, it's working. The world is fine. All right. So the hardest part of anything dealing with corsets is that they're kind of awkward to thread through the sewing machine once they're entirely constructed. Like metal doesn't really bend. So you have to get creative when you are feeding your sewing machine through the machine in order to do any additional stitching. I like to roll mine up so that they're more compact. It makes it a little bit easier to deal with them. Right now, you can see I've got the sewing machine rolled up in the opening on my machine so I can put this portion under my presser foot. I want to get pretty close to the edge. So I'm lining this edge up with the seam of where my presser foot joins to the shank of my sewing machine. I had some suspicions that now it's going to start to be a little bit too thick for my machine to just stitch. So I'm going to pull out my hump jumper. I'm going to put that in the back here. I'm going to manually lower my needle. It's very thick. I'm going to hold that hump jumper in place to allow me to get into the body of the garment. I'm going to sew kind of slow as I progress until it catches. And then I'm going to give myself a little back tack. So I'm going to sew, I'm about 1/8 of an inch in from the edge. If you're not comfortable sewing that close to your edge, just make sure you're sewing within the allowance of the raw edge you pressed under, so is stitched in position, and make sure you're catching all of your laces. As I come to the end, I'm going to give myself another back tack. And now, technically, I don't have to do any other like top stitching or anything like that. This is good enough. It will get me going. My belt is attached. It is in position. But I do like to finish mine off with a little top stitching because it makes it consistent. So I'm actually going to go in and edge stitch the sides as well. I'm going to start where I stopped with that last stitch from the edge. You could do it in one go and just turn at the corners, but because this is so thick, I prefer to stitch this back seam on its own. So I'm going to drop my needle. Still pretty thick there, so I'm going to pull in our little hump jumper. Move the corset out of the way, I hope. There we go. These are great for denim, for jeans, for pants, for doing really thick cuffs on your shirts. They're a handy little tool to have in your kit. And they're not expensive. So once I'm into the body of the fabric, then I give myself a little back tack. If my presser foot falls off the edge of the fabric, I need to use my hump jumper again. Basically, the hump jumper is just getting your presser foot onto the same plane as the thick thing you're sewing, so that the pressure of the presser foot can interact with the feed dogs to move your fabric along properly. What I'm doing here is I'm lining the edge of my fabric up again with this little seam where the presser foot joins to my shank. That helps me keep my edge stitching really neat and tidy and even, or at least visually even. As I come up to the end, this is the end I'm going to put my belt on. I'm actually going to fold my raw edges under on the bottom here. If you want to finish your belt before you put it on and give it a try, you want to go ahead and just like top stitch over this bottom edge. You can see how my raw edges are tucked away. And I'm going to come to this corner and then turn and go across. You may need your hump jumper again. Keep it close. Hold on to it until your feed dogs catch. And I'm going to turn again. Need one more stitch there. There we go. I like it to be lined up. And we're going to go back the way we came. And as I come to the ends, I'm going to finish off with a little back tack. This is where on my machine, at least, it's like, my goodness, you have so many layers in that corner. Why do you hate me? So the size 16 needle would be a little bit easier, but overall the 14 did okay. I do recommend having a size 16 on hand though. And once I've got that all stitched, I'm going to trim my little threads. This is ready to have the belt buckle attached, which is very exciting. So let's talk about that belt buckle a little bit. You're going to do everything I just did for the other side of your corset. You're going to leave one side as the long tongue that is going to thread through your belt buckle. So normally I do the belt buckle side first. This is where I usually put it in place. I pin it. I wear it with a safety pin to make sure I like where it's positioned before I stitch it to finish it off. Because I never know exactly how a corset is going to lace until I have put it on my body and I've worn it and I make sure that it's like as tight as I want it to be. So I find it easiest to make this adjustment on my person once I've worn the corset for like a few hours. But maybe it's a corset you've worn a lot, you're very comfortable with it, you know how long you need your belt to be and you're ready to finish it, or you've done your little trial wearing it, so you're ready to put your buckle in and stitch it. You just want to thread your belt through your buckle, and you're going to take this end and fold it to the back. However long you need it to be folded through the back. If you have a lot that you have a big tongue of fabric, trim it down, tuck those raw edges, stitch them in place with a top stitch. But you want this little metal slider to be loose. You are not putting your belt fabric through the slider because the slider is your locking mechanism. So this is how you put it in. And then all I do, which I'm not going to do today because I do want to do a trial wearing it. All I do is I then stitch as close to that metal bar as I can. And normally I do a couple of stitches, one up close to the metal bar and one further in. I like to use a zipper foot for getting close to my metal bar. So, and that's it. That's how we do our fan lacing. That's how we put our buckle in. Every buckle's a little different. That's how we put this style of buckle in. So you may have to approach attaching your buckle slightly differently if you have a different style of buckle, but choose the buckle that's comfortable for you, or the style that works for you. So that's it. That's how you put your fan lacing in. If you are wanting to have a hook lower on your corset to pull your belt down from your waist so it's not bulking up your waist, you just want to get a really large one of the cape hooks. There are also specialty hooks made by corsetry companies. If you are ordering from Vina Cava to get your hardware sliders for doing your fan lacing, I recommend also buying a corset hook. They're usually about this long and they're very flat to the body. But you are going to stitch that hook down below your waist on your torso, center, front, by your busk, but just in from your busk, and you hook your belt under that, and it will keep it from bulking up your waist. It also works for your corset laces. You'll see them in historical corsets. They just sort of like are these weird hooks on the front of the corsets, and everybody's like, what are they for? They're actually for pulling your waist laces down under your waist across your torso, but keeping the tension so you can remove that bulk from your waist when you're wearing the corset. So that's it. Any questions before we say goodbye for the day, my friends?
Well, I know you can't exactly figure out where the buckle's going to end up if your weight
Right.
shifts from day to day or week to week or whatever. But do
Yeah.
you aim to have it in the middle or do you aim to have it on the side?
So I kind of have it sort of slightly to the side of center because I don't want the metal to rub over the studs of my corset busk. So, but like not too far to the side typically. That said, there are days where I'm like, apparently we are tight lacing today, and it's going to be all the way over on the side of my waist, and that is the life we're living. But I really do try and just have it a little bit to the side of center. It's a great question. Any other questions? I don't want to send you off into the sewing void without answering all of your questions, but I also want to tell you if you're like, I didn't ask any questions during the class, but now it's 2 a.m. on Tuesday and I have questions, you can just post them in the corsetry group. I will be happy to answer them there. You can also DM me and I will answer those questions as soon as I see the DM and I'm able to get to it. So you can always ask me questions later. This is not your last opportunity to ask me questions. Also, sometimes things will arise when you're actually working on the project. You thought it made sense, but now that you're working with the fabric, it's like, I made no sense. I led you down a garden path. Feel free to message me to ask questions. I always want to answer your questions, especially if you've done a class with me. As I was telling Shannon at the beginning, once you've done a corset class with me, that's like a lifetime connection of me being willing to give you advice on corsets whenever you have a question. So, you can always reach out to me. Anyway, that's it. Yeah. You guys, this was fun.